This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 184 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. A couple of weeks ago, I didn't love Andrew Luck against the Bills. While most were pegging him as a QB1, I saw him more as a high-end QB2. And then he went out there and he threw 4 touchdowns on 23 passes. He had just 156 yards. It was the classic process over results situation. I wasn't even that upset for missing that call. Something similar happened last week. I wasn't as high as other analysts were on Deshaun Watson, and he goes out and he throws the ball 20 times, but tosses 5 touchdowns while doing so. So I'll take the L. I whiffed on that one. But I'm not overly upset about not predicting a hyper-efficient game like that. I missed other calls last week too. Carson Wentz was better than expected, Kenyon Barner didn't pan out as a deeper play, and I didn't like Kenyon Drake's matchup, and he scored twice. Really, I just got crushed by that Thursday night game. But things were good too. Marlon Mack beasted again, Jalen Richard got a lot of work as a receiver, Tyler Boyd went off, Devin Funchess didn't do a whole lot, Chris Carson had 100 yards on the ground and a score. It wasn't like everything was bad. Everything outside of the Thursday night game was actually pretty decent. Before we look into Week 9's matchups, I wanted to remind you guys about FanDuel's Gridiron Pick'em game. Just choose the winning teams for all of Sunday's games with no spreads and compete for a chance to win $10,000 split amongst all the top pickers. $10,000 is up for grabs for free every week, so be sure to head over to FanDuel.com and check it out. Fantasy managers who are rostering Drew Brees are in a weird spot right now. We know he's good, but the team has also gotten better defensively versus the start of the year, and he's not being dependent on like we saw from weeks 1 through 3. This isn't really a Mark Ingram thing as it is a game script thing. Mark Ingram returning hasn't made the Saints more run-heavy. The Saints no longer playing catch-up or playing in super close contests has forced a more balanced approach. But here's the good news. In single-digit point margin games this year, Brees has averaged 40 pass attempts per game, and he's tossed at least 2 scores in each of those games. That's far different than the 23 he had last week or the 29 that he saw against Washington. And this week, he'll face a Rams team at home where the Saints are going to have to keep pace with the opposing offense. The over-under in the game is 60. So this may be obvious, but a lot of people were asking me about Brees. Unless you think the Saints are going to blow out the Rams, then you should be playing Drew Brees. He's easily a top 7 quarterback this week in my eyes. The top streamer in Week 9 is Ryan Fitzpatrick. You've got a game with a pretty high 55-point over-under that's going down in Carolina, and the Panthers have actually been a plus matchup for quarterbacks this year. But as usual, we've got to look at the individual offense even before we look at the matchup. And the Bucs offense is a good one for fantasy quarterbacks. When you combine Jameis Winston and Ryan Fitzpatrick's fantasy production this year, they actually come out as the second best quarterback in fantasy in points per game behind only Pat Mahomes. Some of that has to do with scheme, some of that has to do with the lack of running game, some of it has to do with the DGAF nature of both quarterbacks who have really high deep ball rates, and then obviously they have really good weapons to throw to as well. So Fitzpatrick is the top streamer this week, and he should be considered a QB1. If you want to dig a little bit deeper, you could go with Alex Smith. One of the downsides with Smith is that Washington has been the most run-heavy team in the red zone this year. Their .73 pass-to-rush ratio is the lowest in the league within their opponent's 20. So that might limit Smith's overall touchdown potential. Basically, Smith's situation is not necessarily ideal, but the matchup is there. Since facing Nick Foles in Week 1 and suffering a ton of injuries on the defensive side of the ball, Atlanta's allowed a top 10 quarterback performance to every single passer that they've faced. According to NumberFire's expected points model, when you adjust for strength of opponent, the Falcons have the 3rd worst secondary in football. So on the matchup end, things look dope for Smith, and that's why he's a reasonable deeper option. Just do know that there's plenty of downside given how they've handled the offense this season. I know I completely whiffed on Deshaun Watson last week, but I actually think he's being overvalued in Week 9. It has nothing to do with how I feel about Watson the player. I love me some Deshaun Watson, but I don't think he's a locked-in top 10 option on the road in Denver this week. First off, we know Will Fuller is out for the year. We've got a small sample of Watson with and without Fuller, and without him, his yards per attempt rate drops by about 3 yards, and Watson's touchdowns per game rate goes from 2.5 to 1 per contest. There's some noise there, I totally get it. But I don't think we should ignore what Will Fuller can do for this offense because he's an incredible wide receiver who can stretch the field. But more than this is the fact that Watson's just not running the ball like we saw him run the ball to start the year. and that's lowered his overall upside. He has 29 rushing yards across his last 3 games when he was averaging 40 yards per game through the first 5 games of the season. And Denver's not some cakewalk matchup. Because of that crazy game against Arizona, they rank second in number fire secondary rankings, but they still are 11th in points allowed to the quarterback position, and that's while facing Pat Mahomes twice this year. So if you have Watson, I wouldn't be playing a streamer over him this week. Maybe Ryan Fitzpatrick. But there probably aren't many alternatives. I just am trying to temper expectations. And then I'm also not a big believer of Ben Roethlisberger in week 9. I know Baltimore's coming off a bad performance against Cam Newton, but they were also on the road in Charlotte. At home, things are different. I talked about this earlier in the season, but dating back to last year and including their game against the Saints a couple of weeks back, the Ravens have held 9 of 11 opposing quarterbacks to 12 or fewer fantasy points at home. And that includes Big Ben last year, who scored 10.5 against them. Baltimore has one of the best secondaries in the league, and being at home, it's a tough spot for Roethlisberger. Aaron Jones is currently being ranked as a mid-range RB3 on Fantasy Pros and PPR formats, and I don't really get it. Last week, he saw 61.5% of Green Bay snaps, which was the highest snap share for a Packers back since week 1. And in that week 1 game, Jamal Williams was playing without Aaron Jones, who was suspended. Jones has the highest success rate of any back in the Green Bay backfield by far now that Ty Montgomery's out, and he produced well in a more featured role last week. I just don't see why it would make sense for Jones to not be on the field a lot in this one, and now we can feel more confident with Ty Montgomery being sent to Baltimore. And he's facing New England. Maybe you're worried about negative game script and Jamal Williams being on the field because of his pass protection, but the over-under in this contest is 56.5 points, so even if the script gets out of hand, there's opportunity for Jones to score before that happens. And we don't even know if Williams will be on the field in those hurry-up scenarios anyway. Yes, I'm an Aaron Jones truther, but he's getting more work in a good offense. He should be in your fantasy lineups. Isaiah Crowell was actually outsnapped by Trenton Cannon last week against Chicago, but they faced a negative game script, which is something that they might not see in week 9 in Miami. They're only 3-point underdogs. And Crowell still carried the ball 13 times last week. Bilal Powell is out for the year, and we still don't know exactly how Elijah McGuire is going to be used with him coming off IR. As of this recording, that hasn't happened. Elijah McGuire has not been activated. But even if and when it does, I'm not sure how we can project Elijah McGuire to see a lot of work. So Crowell should still see double-digit touches this week, and that's big against Miami, because the Dolphins have been horrendous against opposing backs this year. They've actually allowed at least 17.6 PPR points to a running back in every single game this year. There's certainly some risk, but if there's a back who's going to hit that this week in that Jets backfield, my money would be on Crowell. Chris Thompson missed practice on Wednesday, so we're going to have to monitor that situation and see if he can go in week 9. But if he does, he's got a lot of PPR upside. Atlanta is notorious for allowing receptions to opposing backs. Christian McCaffrey had 15 targets against the Falcons earlier this year. Alvin Kamara had 20. Even Peyton Barber had 4, when Peyton Barber hasn't had more than 2 in any other game. The Falcons have allowed the most receptions to running backs this year, and they've had their bye. In 2017 and 2016, they also ranked first within the category. So if Thompson goes, the pass-catching back should do some work. And if he doesn't, Capri Bibbs makes for an interesting sleeper. Jalen Richard is currently being ranked as a low-end RB2 in PPR formats, and while I understand the notion considering he's pacing for 89 catches this year, it's important to give his role some context. It's one where he's on the field when the Raiders are trailing. There's a reason he has just 2 of his 39 receptions when the Raiders have been leading in games this year. And there's a reason that 30 of his 39 catches have come in the second and fourth quarters. That's where you're likely to see a more hurry-up offense. So this week against San Francisco on Thursday night, I'm more into it being a Doug Martin game than a Jalen Richard game. I don't love trying to predict game script, but we also have to recognize that Richard is sort of a game script dependent back. It's just that the Raiders are often trailing, so he's valuable in PPR formats. I talked about Phillip Lindsay last week as someone who I thought was ranked a little bit too high. It wasn't that I didn't like him. That would be silly considering his opponent and Royce Freeman was sidelined. It was just that he was sort of being ranked at his ceiling. He did score and he was totally good as a fantasy option last week, but he ranked as the RB12, which was sort of the point of bringing him up. This week, I'm seeing him ranked ahead of James Conner on Fantasy Pros, and I don't understand that. Conner has seen Todd Gurley-like usage this year, whereas Lindsay still played just over 56% of Denver's snaps last week. He's been incredibly fun to watch, and he's a good back. And don't get me wrong, I think he's still a fringe RB1 this week. But I would most definitely be playing someone like James Conner over Phillip Lindsay this week, just given the volume floor. And it's not like Houston's an easy matchup. They rank 7th best in success rate allowed to running backs through the air, 2nd best in rushing efficiency allowed, and 10th best in success rate allowed to opposing backs. So just to reiterate, I still like Phillip Lindsay this week, as I did last week. But from strictly a predictability and volume standpoint, I wouldn't be playing him over someone like James Conner. If I like Drew Brees, then I've got to like his pass catchers too. Tre'Quan Smith didn't post a strong performance last week, but Brees also threw for just 120 yards while throwing it 23 times. Smith still played the 2nd most snaps at wide receiver for them while running just 2 fewer routes than Michael Thomas. If we assume that type of snap share continues, which we probably should, he's a really good wide receiver 3 option this week against the Rams. LA has been average against opposing wide receivers this year in fantasy points allowed, but they faced teams like San Francisco, Arizona, and Oakland this year. They gave up a top 10 performance to Mike Williams. Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs were both wide receiver 1s against them. Tyler Lockett and David Moore were both top 16 options. Emmanuel Sanders finished as a wide receiver 10 against them. And then this past week, we saw Davante Adams go for 133 yards. It's a high over-under game, the matchup isn't bad, and Tre'Quan is playing a lot of snaps. You have to like his upside this week. I also like Chris Godwin, or I at least think that Chris Godwin is being undervalued. Everyone is still on Deshaun Jackson over Godwin, but Godwin's played more snaps than D-Jax in each of the team's last 3 games. He's seen far more red zone work across the season, and over those last 3, he has more targets than Deshaun Jackson does. And when Ryan Fitzpatrick was under center through the first 3 games of the season, he looked Godwin's way in the red zone quite a bit. Godwin scored in each of the Bucs' first 3 games this year, and during that time, only 5 players in the NFL had more red zone looks than Godwin. And he also tied Michael Thomas for the league lead in targets within the opponent's 10. So to me, Godwin is actually a decent play this week, especially if you need someone to fill in for a player on a bye. I also think a couple of deeper plays are Geronimo Allison and Marquez Valdes-Scantling. I know Allison didn't do a whole lot this past week, but he still ran 23 routes according to Pro Football Focus, which was 2 fewer than Davante Adams, 1 more than MVS, and 6 more than Randall Cobb. And then obviously MVS scored a touchdown. In a game that should see a lot of points and where the Packers could be in a negative game script, I think you can still feel fine starting either Green Bay wideout in a pinch. I talked about Tyler Lockett on this week's 15 Transactions episode and how he's completely breaking math with his rate of scoring touchdowns. Given his 394 receiving yards based on yards per touchdown rates at wide receiver over the last 7 years, we should expect him to have closer to 2 or 3 touchdowns. Instead, he has 6. So he has touchdown regression coming. He's not going to keep this up. But with Seattle wideouts, you're going to worry about volume. Seattle's the most run-heavy team in the league, so an 18% target share for someone like Lockett isn't necessarily as strong as it could be if he were in a higher volume offense. It helps that he gets Russell Wilson targets, but you'd still like to see more volume. And I'm not sure that we're going to get that in the Seahawks game against the Chargers. Seattle's a 1.5 point favorite, which means the game should be close. And in neutral game script situations this year, both Seattle and LA have run at a bottom 8 pace in football. So I'm afraid that not a lot of plays are going to be run in this contest, which will lower volume, which will then lower the potential in fantasy football. And then that's on top of the touchdown regression side of things. So I think Lockett's being overranked this week. As of this recording, he's at wide receiver 24, which is far too high in my opinion. I also saw that Jordy Nelson was about wide receiver 30, and I don't know how you can feel confident starting him. His peripherals aren't terrible. He played 90% of Oakland snaps last week, and he tied Brandon LaFell for 27 routes run at the position in that Oakland offense. But he caught just 1 of 4 targets last week, and he's failed to reach 50 yards in all but 1 game this year. I would rather play both Godwin and Tre'Quan Smith over Jordy Nelson this week, strictly for upside. But hey, Thursday Night Football seems to be the one game per week that I can't predict right, so Nelson will probably score twice. At tight end this week, I really love the matchup for Greg Olsen. He's seen about 15% of Carolina's targets since coming back from injury, and while CJ Uzomah posted a goose egg against the Bucs last week, prior to that contest, they had allowed a top 6 tight end performance in 5 straight games. There's a high over-under in the game, Olsen's being utilized, and the matchup is there. You've got to like him. One player that you might have lost faith in after last week is David Njoku. He didn't see a single target against Pittsburgh in a negative game script after seeing 7, 11, 12, and 6 targets in his 4 games prior. But Njoku did play 84% of Cleveland's snaps. He was on the field. He just so happened to not be targeted in a really bad game by the Browns offense. But this week, they're at home facing a team that's allowed the second most yards to tight ends this year. Considering the Browns will probably face a negative game script, Njoku should see volume. If you want to dig deeper, Ben Watson's not a bad choice. It goes back to what I've been saying about Drew Brees and Tre'Quan Smith. This is a high over-under game, and there should be more passing than what we've seen from the Saints over the last few games. And in games this year where the Saints have had to be a little bit more pass happy, like the first 3 games of the season, according to Pro Football Focus, Watson ranked 9th, 19th, and 10th in weekly routes run at the tight end position over those first 3 weeks. Honestly, he's probably the top tight end streamer this week in a week that's really bad for streaming, but that's usually the case. 2 lower tier defenses that you can play this week are Dallas and Kansas City. Dallas is at home as a 6.5 point favorite on Monday night against Tennessee with a pretty low 41 point game total. So that should give them a high floor. On the year, all but one defense is ranked in the top 15 in weekly scoring against Tennessee, and across their last 3 games, the Titans have been sacked 2, 11, and 2 times. So I think the Cowboys are a pretty safe option, but they might not have a massive ceiling. Kansas City might though. The Chiefs are on the road and that makes them a risky play, but they're a high variance option considering the Browns have allowed the most sacks this year, and Kansas City is actually tied for second in the NFL in sacks. To be fair, they haven't had their bye, but they've at least gotten to the quarterback. The Browns could also go in one of 2 directions this week with a new coaching staff. They could thrive, or they could completely crumble. If you want to gamble, the Chiefs are a decent streaming choice. That's going to be it for today's show, though. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. And make sure you're following me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the mailbag episode.